You have a great piece that you just wrote for The Hill called Elizabeth Warren's Vagueness on Medicare Isn't Fooling Anyone. Now, there are some of these examples, like the Medicare-For-All framework comment, there was a lot of pushback on. People said that the broader context of the question was about a very specific issue, which, by the way, I think everybody could agree. She clearly didn't have an answer about disability eligibility for people with MS, which was the question. And she did go into vociferously attacking insurance companies. However, and you document this really well in the article, that fits into a long enough of a pattern of super ambiguous statements, as well as the late release of even a healthcare write-up on her webpage, that we really have to start to ask, what's going on here?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, if you can think back to January, there was an issue where publicly she said that she was supportive of Medicare-For-All. She appeared to be unequivocal in her support. And then immediately after that, some of her staffers spoke to the press and backpedaled on it. And so that was, a red flag for me. But then following that, she was super strong on Medicare-For-All on the debate stage. I had seen other interviews where she was touting the need for Medicare-For-All, and I was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, but there was just an increasing amount of evidence to the contrary. Like the CBS interview following the last Democratic debate, where she said, I support Medicare-For-All. And she had this weird tone to her voice. I know I'm maybe making too much of it, but it was the same high-pitched ending to the sentence that you would expect from someone who's not telling the truth. And then she immediately followed that with, I like a lot of plans. And then for me, that was it. I like a lot of plans? No. Medicare-For-All is a giant piece of legislation that's going to take a lot to get through Congress. And if you start off with this wishy-washy, well, maybe there are other plans I'm considering, then no, you're not going to fight for it. And everyone's different, so I don't want to be overly judgmental to people who disagree with me. But for me, Medicare-For-All is non-negotiable.
Yep.
If you don't support Medicare-For-All, I'm not even interested in having a conversation with you as a candidate. And it's based on my life experiences. It's based on the fact that, my mother had chronic kidney disease and needed a transplant. In 2016, I just remember the fear of not knowing whether we were going to be able to pay her medical bills because her dialysis wasn't covered. I mean, it was just a nightmare. And I don't want anyone to have to go through that. I don't want Americans to suffer from, these record bankruptcies because they can't afford something that should be a basic human right. So if she's going to waffle on that issue, she's not the candidate for me.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I also just want to spell something out that's also really important in this. And you as you pointed out, rightfully so, you've actually read this bill. This bill actually means something, right? We're talking about, so even in the context of the answer, I think, look, no politician is very unlikely, especially if their brand is plans, is going to tell you, I don't know the answer to a highly specific question. But the broader answer is actually really clear and really simple if you were fighting for that, at least from the perspective of the Sanders bill, which is that maybe the Sanders bill doesn't have a specific answer to disability eligibility for MS within the next year, 2, 3, or 4 years. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. You would know better than me, frankly. But what the bill does have an answer to, and what it spells out in an incredibly clear and detailed way, is that we're going to drop Medicare down in different age increments, from each year till gradually over the course of 4 years, every single American, every single person in this country, regardless of their health status, finances, anything, is going to get full, complete health care. That's
exactly,
there's nothing ambiguous about that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm glad that you brought that up. And, I wish I would have included that answer in the piece that I wrote, because whatever coverage that individual has right now, right? The person who asked that question during Elizabeth Warren's town hall. Whatever coverage he has, that coverage will remain until he is transitioned to Medicare-For-All. And then once he's transitioned to Medicare-For-All, that single-payer system covers everything. So while it's true that the actual legislation written by Bernie Sanders doesn't specify how things would work out for someone who has MS, it does specify what the transition would look like. Now, let's say in, our ideal world where we get Medicare-For-All, as this transition is happening, it's not like Americans would lose their private insurance. Private insurance wouldn't outright be banned from the get-go. Again, it would be a transition period, and everyone would have the coverage they currently have until they're transitioned into this single-payer healthcare system.
Exactly. So, and I just want to say, too, just to also really keep spelling this out. So with Warren, we don't really know. If we look at her website, it sounds like some type of version of Medicare-For-All, which, at least as it's written on the website, could be more analogous to some type of public option, which is what Buttigieg is talking about when he says Medicare-For-All who choose it, which is, definitionally absurd. And he has probably the most overtly dishonest position of any of them, I would say. Or she does support some type of basic elemental Medicare-For-All, but one that is much more limited because, again, the Sanders plan also covers dental and mental health and other really vital services, which, as of now, Warren clearly does not. And I just want to really put this on the table, too, because some people, and it's fun, I've actually been starting to get a little bit into reading about different global health systems and how does it actually work in France? How does it actually work in the United Kingdom? And some people will say Germany and France have socialized medicine, but private insurance still exists. They aren't banned. And I just want to make incredibly clear that if that's going to be your argument, then your candidate better come forward with a French plan, which has even more aggressive and expansive governmental coverage than the NHS in some ways. And yes, there's a handful of private insurers, which are nonprofits or owned by the shareholders themselves. There is public hospitals. There's paid for maternity and paternity care. Let's not use examples from the world that are way to the left of anything that, Warren or Buttigieg is remotely putting on the table to undermine what is the most comprehensive and progressive plan. Let's not bullshit like that, please.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the United States and our system of government and the legalized bribery that we now have baked into our system of government, in my opinion, makes it very likely that let's say a public option proposal, if we get something like a public option passed, would it be a bit of an improvement from what we have now? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. But it just wouldn't work out in the way that it might in a different country because of the legalized bribery that we have baked into our system. So a good way to, maybe draw parallels is a public option healthcare system to, let's say, public education. Mm-hmm. Okay, so with public education, look at how incredibly easy it was for private interests and, the wealthiest to lobby hard to get public education defunded in America. Mm-hmm. I mean, in California alone, the LAUSD was one of the top public school systems in the early 1970s. In the late 1970s, Californians passed Prop 13, which is it was a complete and utter disaster. It capped property taxes at a little over 1%. And that's how education is funded. And so once that happened, the public education system was defunded to the point where now the LAUSD is at the bottom of public school systems in the country. Now, in that case, it was a ballot initiative that unfortunately passed. And in order to raise taxes, you need a 2/3 majority among lawmakers in the state of California. That's never going to happen.
Right.
And so the public education system has just completely fallen apart, and it'll continue to fall apart. You look at the private prison model. Look at what private prisons do, and I think this is the same thing that'll happen with private insurers if we get a public option. Private prisons ensure that they only accept prisoners that are inexpensive to imprison, right? So these are low-level drug offenders, people who don't have mental health issues. And then all of the individuals who are, more expensive to incarcerate, people who have mental health issues, for instance, they end up in the public system. And it becomes much more expensive in the public system to incarcerate people. So I bring this up because we're going to have all sorts of challenges and issues with the public option. So for people who think, no, public option is a great, way to go about this, at least you're going to have the ability to take government health insurance if you want it, or you can go to the private system. But it's not that clear cut, and it's not that easy. There's a lot of room for corruption. There's a lot of room for, defunding the government plan.
That's just 100%. I'm so with it. And I also I shy away from the rhetoric of corruption for a lot of different reasons, but I think you're 100% right. And I think that this really does go to the heart of the difference between people who understand the power and corruption dimensions of these questions versus thinking of them as technical challenges, right? Like, if it's just sort of, we could design some elegant technical system and then people can decide, or even if people are going back 10, 15 years, which was like what people did, a public option obviously wasn't even in the ACA, but some of the people who advocated a public option at the time were very clear, at least like in their academic writing, like basically the public option will be so good that it will gradually like morph into Medicare-For-All, because who the hell wants to deal with private insurance when government healthcare is so much better, right? But we're not at that point now. We're at a point now where it's an all or nothing fight. And I think you're exactly right that the actual constituent power of these interests will shift a higher economic burden onto a public option, but they'll also fight to keep the public option at a lower quality so they can just keep operating a parasitic business which doesn't provide any value. Like, it's useless.
Yeah, I don't believe in creating a two-tiered system for healthcare.
Right.
And to be quite honest with you, I long for the day when we have a presidential candidate who says that there shouldn't be a two-tiered system in education either. Absolutely. I mean, I look at Finland, and they have banned private education. And as a result, they have the best education. They're at the top of all these various rankings because of the fact that they banned private education. So you have, some of the more wealthy individuals paying into the public system. And when I say paying into the public system, it means that they have, they're higher stakes. Like, they actually care about ensuring that the public system works, because their kids are going to public schools. And so I would love for someone like Bernie Sanders to say, you know what? I think I want to do away with private schools as well.
I love it. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.